First video on the extended project qualification for students at Old Twinford Hospital. So today, with this first video, we're going to look at what the EPQ actually is, what it could lead to, and hopefully you should be able to get to a point where you can start thinking about topics that could be okay for you, things that you might want to explore. I'll obviously send through a YouTube video every single week. If there's any questions, just drop me an email and I'll get back to you. The booklet that I've emailed alongside this is designed so that you can complete different tasks alongside each video. So this is lecture 1, so there's a number of different tasks that you should be filling alongside watching this. And that's really just as a record to show that you've been going through these skills for the extended project qualification. Is an independent self-directed project of your own choosing. So you get to select your own topic, you create your own focus question. It's not an examination, but it does require work to a standard of an A level. So it isn't something that is an easy option, it isn't something that is a soft choice. This is quite tricky. It could be an extended investigative research-based essay, or what people at undergraduate level, so university level, would say is a dissertation. It wouldn't be to the same length as a normal dissertation, but it's still pretty comprehensive. Or what you might want to do is to do an experiment if you're quite scientific. That might be quite tricky under the current circumstances. Or you might wish to create something, which is called an artifact when we're looking at the EPQ. Again, that might be quite tricky at the moment. It might be that post-lockdown, when there's different parts that are lifted across the country, that might be a bit easier. But with regard to an essay, it could be that you start the ball rolling on that, or you get the preparation ready for an artifact. For the EPQ, you maintain a log of your own experience and progress as you're going alongside it, and it's something that is incredibly valuable. It's something that is a level 3 qualification, so it's equivalent intellectually to an A level, so what people do at the end of year 13. It's equivalent from a UCAS points perspective or a qualification perspective to an AS level. So the maximum points that you can get from it, they're called UCAS points, is 28 if you get an A star, and the EPQ is graded from A star to U. Increasing numbers of universities are placing huge value on the EPQ, and that's usually reflected on UCAS or university offers. So universities really value students that do the EPQ because of a number of different reasons, and I'll come on to them in a second. What they sometimes do is they say our usual offer might be 3 A's, but if you get an A in your EPQ, we'll reduce your overall offer. So it's incredibly sought after by universities. Specific universities that have commented on this have been University of Manchester, University of Southampton, University of Cambridge, and the list really goes on and on and on. So in terms of the skills that the EPQ helps to develop, it's what we call competency skills or soft skills, and these are things that employers are specifically looking for and are asking about when they do interviews. So any kind of interview for a job, they'll be talking about competency-based skills. These are things like independence, research-based skills, critical thinking, problem solving, project planning, management, self-discipline, self-motivation. These are things that will help you obviously with your sixth form studies, because you'll have something called independent study time, but they'll also increasingly help you at university when there's fewer contact hours, and it will help you with the workplace as well. The EPQ is a relatively recent introduction to level 3 qualifications. It's only been around for about 10 years or so, just slightly more than 10 years, and employers are starting to get quite savvy about this. Starting to know what the EPQ is, and as a consequence, it's something that when there is an interview, people can talk about how they've honed these particular skills through the EPQ. The EPQ is marked. It's marked out of 50, and it's as I've said already, it's graded from A star to U. Now, it isn't just the case that what you complete for your essay or complete for your artifact gives you that overall mark. It doesn't work like that. So what happens is you have to complete 3 things for your EPQ. The first is, like I've already said, an essay or an artifact, and I'll come on to what those potentially could be on in a second. The second thing that you need to complete is a production log. This is like a diary, and it's a log of the process as you're going along this. Now, in the second video, so next week, I'll talk a bit more about the production log, and hopefully you can start thinking about how you can record down your ideas there. The third thing that you have to do is at the very end of the course, you have to present your findings and your experience, and you have to do that in front of an audience. That will be a few members of staff, and it will be your peer group as well. The things that you're assessed on aren't necessarily just the academic content of the topic and the essay, the artifact that you produced. It's about the skills. So those things that I've just mentioned: management of the project, use of resources, deselection of material that you've decided isn't relevant, the development and realization of your project as you're going along this particular process, your ability to reflect, evaluate, change your mind. These are all things that are marked, and the EPQ is marked holistically. So what that means is we don't just take one of the areas, we don't just take the essay, we look at all of the components of the essay or the artifact, the production log and the presentation, and we mark as a collective. That means that it's quite difficult to comment prior to say, oh yeah, you're working towards this particular grade. Again, the EPQ doesn't really work like that. We can't, as well as we're going along, tell you what grade we think you're working at. We have to wait until we get everything at the end, and then we can calculate a grade for you. So if you are doing an EPQ and you decide that you wish to pursue this, you obviously have a choice as to how your project looks. You could write an essay, or you could do an artifact. If you were to write an essay, it would consist of up to 5,000 words, which is an extensive amount. It's probably the most that you'll have ever written. Now, what we do is we coach you, and in later videos we'll talk about how we can break down that 5,000 word limit into manageable chunks that are easily achievable. If you decide that you want to produce an artifact, and your artifact could be absolutely anything, so I've had students before that have built different products. So we had a student that built a shed. I marked a project once that where a student built a canoe. You can create a scientific experiment, you can make a song, you can create choreography pieces. If you are going to do that artifact, you still have to write a written report to go alongside it. That's about 2,000 words. The vast majority of students will choose the written project over the artifact, but that shouldn't deter you from going down the artifact route. And it's not the case that there's one which is better. I've seen very, very good artifacts. I've seen very good written projects. Likewise, I've seen not good written projects and not so good artifacts. In terms of when the EPQ needs to be done by, well, you can actually set your own pace for this. So you may wish to submit all of this by the end of year 12, so this time next year, November of year 13, or at the end of year 13 at the end. We recognise that the EPQ has to go alongside of your A-level subjects or your BTEC subjects, and as a consequence, you can do this at your own pace. So what some students do is they say, I'll set aside 2 hours every single week to just keep going with my EPQ. Now that we're in this period of lockdown and social distancing, it might be difficult to have some of the formal meetings which are required for the EPQ, but you can make a good start with the projects now, and we can send advice over email on certain ideas that you've got. One thing that we will have to say when it comes to the EPQ is that we cannot direct you and tell you what to do. We can only offer advice. So that's slightly different to the arrangement that you perhaps have with your GCSE subjects and what you will have with your. So the EPQ process generally looks like this, and you're at that first stage at the top. Really what we need to be doing at this particular point is doing some initial planning and starting to think, what kind of topics would you be interested in? Then what we do is we have a process by which you say, these are my ideas, and we decide whether they're appropriate and whether they're feasible, and we give you approval on that. You then start planning, and that involves you researching your topics, and you can do a lot of this on the internet. Ideally, you need to go to a library. You do need to look at books. That's where most of the answers will be for your chosen questions. But a lot of information, particularly initial research, you can find on the internet. We then have a review meeting, which is called a mid-project review. We could potentially do that digitally, but it would be better if we could do that when you come back in September and we can have a conversation. You then produce that project. So if it's the essay or the artifact, you make it. We then have an end of project review, so we talk about it, we give you advice, but again, we can't tell you to remove certain sections, we can't tell you to change this or don't like this particular area. We can only give you generic advice, and it's up to you to read those particular comments or listen to those comments and evaluate and reflect critically on yourself. At the very end, what you then do is you then present your particular work. It's about 15 minutes or so. You talk about the things that you've learnt from this. It's not necessarily just on the chosen topic that you're looking at. It's more about yourself and being critically reflective. And then at the very end, you hand in everything. So that's your essay or artifact, your production log, and then finally evidence of your presentation. Now, you do have a number of weeks in which to reflect on various ideas for your EPQ before settling in on one. So where it says the initial planning stage, that doesn't need to be done in this first week and then we move on to the next step. It might be the case that you spend a lot of time on one particular area and then not so long on another. If you take a sufficient amount of time planning and researching, then the production stage will be a lot shorter. That's advice that a lot of undergraduate teachers will be passing on to students that are doing dissertations. The more that you plan and the more time that you take on that and the more critical you are at that stage, the higher quality of that final production you'll see. What kind of questions could you potentially attempt? Now, the vast majority of students will go for an essay question as opposed to an artifact. But what I'm going to try and do is just explain what kind of questions aren't relevant as well as what questions are relevant. With artifacts, what I would say is if you've got an idea about something that you want to create or imagine, come up with it as an idea, and next week in lecture 2 we talk a little bit more about what are effective artifact questions. So don't just discount essay questions at this stage. I would suggest that for all students that they initially come up with some ideas for essays and then start thinking about potential artifact questions. So the common problems that we have with essay questions for the EPQ are questions that are either unrealistic in their scope, so it's not possible really to answer it. It might be too broad, it might be too difficult, it might even be impossible to go through. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to explain each of the questions that aren't appropriate and then the questions that are appropriate and why there's a difference between them. So if you don't know what MRSA is a bug that was very prevalent about 15 years ago in hospitals, and it spread like wildfire. If you had a question that, if you're interested in maybe science and you're interested in medicine, you might be thinking, I wouldn't mind doing something on MRSA or maybe a different disease, maybe something current like coronavirus. So how does coronavirus spread? That wouldn't be an appropriate question for an EPQ because it would be purely descriptive. You'd just be saying, here is what happened. And really, you could take that information from Wikipedia. It doesn't involve you really researching a topic. A question that would be appropriate would be something that you could make a judgment on, you could analyse. So something like, is the UK at risk from new germs unaffected by antibiotics? And that would be a critical judgment that you could make. It might be a really tough question to approach for an EPQ, but in terms of a stylistic approach, that would be okay as a question. Likewise, if you were to approach a topic to do with history, and maybe you were interested in the history of crime and punishment, a topic entitled A History of Crime and Punishment 1066 to 2014, again, wouldn't be appropriate. Instead, it would be really just an information grab that you could get from again, something like Wikipedia. If you were to do a comparative question, so something like which ruler really uses terror to control their subjects, William I or William the Conqueror or David Cameron, that would allow you to make a critical judgment and analysis of both individuals. Let's take a slightly different approach for this third one. So let's say that you decide that you want to study government and politics for A-level. Now, the question on the left looks and reads as a really good question for an EPQ. And if you weren't doing government or politics, government and politics for A-level, then you could do this question. So the question is, are referendums truly democratic? That would be a really good question unless you were doing government and politics. You couldn't do it for government and politics because it's not an extension from your subject area. So if you did government and politics, you would actually have that as a potential essay question. So it's really important for your EPQ that you don't do anything that is on your A-level syllabuses, so the subjects that you wish to choose. So I'm a history teacher. If I wanted to do a question that was on William the Conqueror, that wouldn't be appropriate because that's something that I study at A-level. If you wanted to still do something which was related to that particular subject, that's okay. It's as long as it's not on the specification. So let's say that I am a government and politics student. Let's say that I'm still interested in referendums. I could do this question: was the 2014 Scottish referendum a triumph for democracy? Because that's not something on the specification. So what you might want to do is, if you're interested in doing an EPQ that relates to one of your A-level subjects, read through the specification and just double check to see if it's closely related to that. As part of the project approval stage, we help students with this and we say whether or not it is a true extension and really an extended project away from their A-levels. Finally, a question which wouldn't be appropriate would be something like, does God exist? The reason why it's not appropriate is it's too broad, it's too difficult, it's impossible to prove one way or another. It's a question that's battled philosophers and theologists for thousands of years, and it's not really going to be possible or feasible in a 5,000 word EPQ. You could still do something related to that topic, so something like why are so many British teenagers choosing to be atheist would be appropriate, that would be okay. At this particular stage, what you need to do is you need to start thinking, well, what kind of questions or artifacts would I be interested in? So in your booklets that I've given you, you've got a number of things that would be useful for you to have a think about and to be critically reflective on. The first is rating yourself on a number of different skills. For the EPQ, those 7 skills that I've listed there are quite useful. Now we will try and develop and hone some of those skills, but it's for some of them there are things there that you can improve on yourself. The first thing after that I would like you to do is to then write down what your gut instinct topic would be for the EPQ, and it can be absolutely anything. The only things that you can't do, as I've already said, are things that are too broad. So things like, does God exist? Things that are specifically on your specification for A-level. And finally, things that are not age appropriate. So for example, I had a student once who was very interested in the Netflix series Narcos, which was about the life of Pablo Escobar, who was a Colombian drug lord. As a topic to do with Colombian drug lord Pablo Escobar, she ended up doing an EPQ on that, but she couldn't do an EPQ that was on Narcos because it was an 18 certificate, and as she was doing her EPQ at the age of 16 and 17, it wasn't appropriate for her to be analysing a TV series that wasn't for 16 and 17-year-olds. So first and foremost, write down that gut instinct topic. Then have a bit of a think about those 4 other questions. So are there any topics that you want to find out more about? And that can be things that aren't necessarily to do with school. Are you thinking of going to university or employment after school in certain specific areas? And are there any topics that would complement your future choices? So let's say that you're interested in being a vet. Are there questions that would relate to that? It doesn't necessarily have to be the case that if you want to be a vet, you have to do an EPQ related to veterinary science or veterinary medicine, but there might be questions that relate to it, and it might be of interest to you. What subjects do you enjoy most at school? Why do you think that is? And it could be that there's a very specific topic in a certain subject that you're doing that you want to explore further. What activities do you feel passionate about outside of school? You can't necessarily just do something that you've already done, but you can do something which is an extension to a hobby or an activity that you're already involved in. So I had a student that was very interested in equestrian and equine science. It was something that they did outside of school, and it's something that they were able to complement through EPQ. Likewise, I had a student that was didn't do dance as an A level, but was an active dancer outside of school. So for her EPQ, she coordinated a dance that was related to the 7 deadly sins. That was her artifact. So what I would suggest that you do is you take a bit of time and go through this. Then if you've got some time available after that, and if your parents or guardians are okay with this, get them to have a look through this, because they might be able to offer a few different pointers. So actually, you are interested in this, why not consider this particular topic? It might be as well that you do something that's not related to any of this, and it might just be something that you've just got a private interest in. So I had a student once that did their EPQ on K-pop, and that was something that they had a specific interest in outside of school. The thing that you might want to start doing is, once you've done that particular sheet, it might be useful for you to start coming up with a number of different ideas or related questions in a different format. You might want to do that in a spider diagram. It might be that you start with the theme in the central components. It might be, I'm interested in RE and philosophy, and these are different areas of RE and philosophy that I'm interested in. So the Gospels, I might want to focus in on that, the teleological arguments, and then start branching out ideas from that. You can do something similar, which is called an ideas grid, and you can write down a number of key ideas as heading for each column. You can then work through each column at a time, noting down different topic areas, writing down benefits, shortfalls, effectiveness, whether there's any costs at all. You can do that for each of the columns, and that will mean that you can be critical about the different kinds of questions that you've got. So you might decide that you could do a mood board. So I'm just going to put down different pictures, different ideas, and put them all together. All of these things might seem quite trivial, but with the EPQ, as I've already mentioned, you'll have something which is called a production log. And if you've got evidence of how you've formulated ideas or how you've been critically reflective, then you can pick up marks. So even if you're starting something at this particular early stage, and you're getting some ideas down and you're writing what kind of things you might not want to, you might wish to do, but actually there's a bit of a problem with this area, then we could use that when we're marking the EPQ overall. So for this particular week, the week commencing the 20th of April, this is what I would suggest that you do as a starting point. And it might be that you continue to do this over a number of weeks. It might be the case that you've come up with a definitive idea over the course of maybe 2 days. It might be 2 weeks, and it's your pace. So that's the sheet that you should really have a go at and complete as evidence. You can do additional things to that. If you have any questions, just give me an email, and we will go through a different skill set, so a different thing next week. It will be focused in on how you can form a specific question that relates to the topic area that you're interested in. Thanks very much for watching and for listening as well.